And my name is Corey Ross. I'm the district manager for the Windham County Conservation District. And I'm excited to be able to partner with the USDA and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Farms and Markets for this program today to try to improve awareness and understanding about the programs that are out there to help pay for the implementation of conservation practices on farms and other agricultural land, I should say. Before I introduce our presenters, I just want to go over a couple of quick things that the district has going on right now. We are participating in a project to try to identify conservation practices that farmers have implemented on their land without funding from the state or the federal government. So if you've done something like put up an exclusion fence to keep livestock out of a stream, or manure injection, cover crops, conservation crop rotation, riparian buffers, if you've done any practices like that that you paid for yourself, we would love to come out and document those. It's helpful for the state of Vermont to report the phosphorus or nitrogen reductions, which have ramifications for total maximum daily load rules. And it's just kind of about getting credit for things that you're doing that are good for the land. So if that's something that you've done and you're willing to spend a few minutes talking to me on the phone about it, you can reach out to me. I'll put my contact info in the chat box in a little bit. So that's one thing. And then the district participates in helping farmers with their nutrient management plans. If you are a certified small farm or even a non-certified small farm that mechanically spreads manure or fertilizer, there are funds available to help with going through the nutrient management planning course, and you can get help paying for the software, and you can get help with the manure sampling and soil sampling. And now's a really good time if you're thinking about doing that in 2022. Now's a great time to reach out and kind of start the planning process for that. And then finally, there's an ongoing initiative to identify possible wetland restoration and conservation sites. So if you have a field that floods every spring, you know, that your tractor gets stuck in, or that doesn't seem like it's really worth maintaining in terms of its yield, there are funds out there to convert and restore that back to a wetland and place it in an easement, and you would get some cash for that. So it can be a good way to make a little bit of money and also restore some habitat. And you can reach out to me if you're interested in that. And without further ado, our first presenter is Joshua Allen with the Natural Resources Conservation Service based out of Brattleboro, and I will let him take it away.
Thank you, Corey. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this event, and hopefully the information that I relate to you all today will be beneficial, and then we can have some conversations going forward about conserving natural resources on your property. So as Corey stated, my name is Joshua Allen. I'm a soil conservationist in the Brattleboro field office, and I cover Windham County. And this presentation is the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services. Well, it's going to be a lot of acronyms said throughout this presentation, so I'm going to take some time to break down some of those acronyms as well. But NRCS is the Natural Resources Conservation Services, and this is the Landowner's Guide to Programs. So let's just go ahead and dive right on in. So first and foremost, we're going to go through the life cycle of an application. Accepting conservation technical assistance or CTA requests. Request forms or applications can be accepted year-round and processed within an established funding round. So let's say, for example, for fiscal year 2021, round one applications, the deadline was November 20th, 2020. And for those who are interested after this presentation, you want to submit an application for any of NRCS's programs, the round two deadline for applications is March 19th, 2021. So there's still some time to get an application in if you're interested. And acceptable application submissions include hand delivery. You can fax it in if you still have a fax machine. You can mail it into the office. If you are able to print it out, scan it, and email it to the office, I can take it that way. And there's also an online option that's called OneSpan. And for those who are interested in that, what's needed is a mobile number as well as an email just to get in the system, so that way we can send all the necessary documentation for your signatures. Next, we go through eligibility through the Farm Service Agency, or FSA. So this documentation is primarily for producers or customers that are new to working with federal agencies. And there are certain documentations that are needed to make sure that we can, one, make sure we can identify you in the system, and then make sure that you are in fact eligible for federal funding. So I'll go through these, the forms themselves. I've actually sent all the forms to Corey. So for those who are interested, he can forward these forms along. You can contact me, we can go through them, and even be in contact with Eric Winchester, who works for the Farm Service Agency, to answer any questions that I may not be able to answer, or that, maybe that may come up. So the first form is the AB 1026 highly erodible land form. So this form is pretty much to assess any agricultural practices that a producer may be implementing, either before applying for assistance or even after applying for assistance, to make sure that no practices are going to cause for erosion, making sure you're not doing any type of, disturbance of ground where you're going to give way to a landslide, or, different cuts in the ground that can be for, for erosion, things like that nature. And most of these documents, they're going to be asking for general information, so you can just assume that you're going to have to provide some general information with each form, but each form serves a specific purpose. So this one is to make sure that you are knowledgeable of the fact that any practices that you may be implementing on your practice would not be cause for erosive effects. Next is the CCC 902 Farm Operating Plan. So this form is used to identify a signature authority, whether it be, an entity or a trust or an LLC, or even if it's just an individual, or even a couple, married couple, just to identify who can sign for this particular application and potential contract. The CCC 941, this is the average adjusted gross income form. So this form is to assess an applicant's income. And for those who make less than $900,000, and this is one of my more humorous forms I go through with my customers, because if you're making that much money, I may have to ask you for a loan. But if you're making less than $900,000 averaged over 3 years, this particular form, it's just a yes or no if you make more or less. And that form is sent to the IRS for confirmation. And if you make less, of course, you'll be eligible for NRCS or even FSA related funding opportunities. Is there a question? Oh, I thought I heard a mic. So next we're going to go into the control of land. And this is going to be something that the Farm Service Agency or FSA is going to need to identify your property. So they're going to need a copy of your deed or your lease agreement to say that you have control over that particular property for X amount of years, or you have control over it because you own it. And then to establish how much acreage you have control of. And then the last document is going to be the SF 1199A, which is the direct deposit form. This form isn't as pertinent during the application phase. Deposit form, it isn't as pertinent during the application stage because you haven't really been funded for anything at that particular point in time. However, it is recommended to submit whenever you're submitting this documentation, so that way it's easier and more efficient to process an application if you are selected for funding. That way we don't have to worry about looking for, making sure, having the right information, where these funds are going to be direct deposit. So that one's just recommended to have earlier on. So now we're going to talk about NRCS programs. And I decided to focus on 3 specific programs, just so I don't overload everybody with too much information in one setting. And these tend to be more of the popular programs in the New England area anyway. So first being the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP. I'm pretty sure folks have heard of EQIP before. The Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. And then the Agricultural Management Assistance Program, which is AMA. So first we'll go through EQIP. So through EQIP, NRCS provides producers or customers with one-on-one help and financial assistance to plan and implement improvements while mitigating targeted resource concerns. And mitigating these concerns, NRCS would implement conservation practices. So whenever you're thinking about applying for assistance, you have to be able to link a conservation practice to a resource concern, or a resource concern to a conservation practice. So I wanted to kind of give some examples. So a resource concern that, let's say, a farmer may have would be soil quality. So I'm getting myself confused, different conservation practices to mitigate a soil quality resource concern issue could be cover crop with conservation crop rotation. Implementing these cover crops to maintain that soil aggregation and providing some nutrients to that soil, and then a crop rotation to overall maybe mitigate some disease or pest cycles that may be happening, as well as maintaining the quality of the soil and reducing soil erosion because you have that vegetative structure and that root structure holding that soil in place. Another could be plant pest pressure for those who may have forest land, controlling some of these invasives that we have all over southern Vermont. You can't seem to get ahead of them, but being able to control them or at least manage them well could reduce, some of the efforts that you have to put in going forward. So the resource concern would be plant pest pressure, and the associative practice could be brush management or even early successional habitat development, or like a patch cut, being able to cut some of that land down to allow for regrowth to come in. NRCS will help that customer, that participant, develop a conservation plan that meets their goals and vision while conserving natural resources. And we offer about 200 unique practices designed for farms, ranches, and forests. But I will say this as a disclaimer, a lot of these practices may only be offered in certain areas or applicable for certain areas. And then we have to consider making sure that we have the specialists on staff to be able to assess that resource concern and make sure we can come up with an effective and efficient conservation plan for that producer and that applicant. Because we don't want to ever want to devise a plan half-baked and you go into contract and then we have to worry about modifying and trying to fix a plan and make it fit, as opposed to doing our due diligence up front. And then lastly, NRCS within this particular program can cover part of the cost of implementing these conservation practices. So since I've been working with NRCS, it's been a rough 75% cost share for those contract holders, more or less 75% cost share, depending on the practice, and then who actually does the work for that producer, because it would be up to the producer to, get their contractor, get the work done, things like that. So it's a rough 75% cost share. Next program would be the Conservation Stewardship Program. And this program is a tad bit different. I moved here, just a little background information from me. I moved to Vermont from Texas. And one of the statements in Texas in relation to EQIP as it contrasts CSP, where EQIP would be referred to as the Buick whenever you're getting your first car, you're getting started trying to control some of these resource concerns. And CSP was denoted as the Cadillac. You conserve resource concerns. Let's incentivize you to continue your conservation efforts and make these enhancements to, better your operation and better, your management style. So the Conservation Stewardship Program, it addresses various resource concerns where EQIP was more targeted. So with CSP, we are assessing, soil quality, soil erosion, water quality, quantity, air quality, plant resources, and animal resources, in addition to energy, on land uses that you control. And with CSP, another difference is that CSP is a 5-year program where EQIP could be, as short as 1 year or as long or up to 5 years. It could vary depending on the system that you're applying for. So with CSP, we're assessing all the land that you have control of. So let's say if you have, 5 acres of cropland, 5 acres of pasture land, and you may lease another 2 acres of forest land. All of those acreages and all of those land uses that you have control of would have to be involved with this particular program. So that's something to consider too. And another difference between the two programs is how they work with payments. So CSP is annually based payments, where EQIP is, if you finish a particular practice and it meets NRCS's standards and specifications, then we can, start that payment process. So those are just some of the general differences on how the programs work. So with CSP, it provides 2 possible payment types, within this 5-year contract, and it's all annual payments. So the first payment would be a land use payment. So you get a particular rate for each particular land use you have control of. So there's a particular rate for cropland, there's a particular rate for pasture land, there's a particular rate for forest land. And however much you control within each land use, you get a particular amount for. So if you own 5 acres of cropland and it's $5 an acre, that's $25 of cropland that you would have entered into, or 25 acres that we could pay annually for that contract. And then additionally, you would get a payment for resource concerns met at the time of application. So with CSP, we're assessing your stewardship for your property. So meeting a resource concern would be, you've either done past contracts with NRCS, or you're doing your own due diligence as far as conservation to meet these resource concerns. So let's say if you have cropland, you've been doing your conservation crop rotations, you've been doing cover cropping, you've been doing, buffers, things like that to mitigate any resource concerns that you may have, so you met a particular resource concern. So as long as you meet a minimum of 2 resource concerns, you'll be eligible for this particular program. And then let's say, hypothetically, I'll go off the 2020's cost share amounts. So it was $300 per resource concern. So if you meet a minimum of 2, that's already an extra $600 that's being added to this annual payment. And the more you accumulate within a resource concern, the more your payment would be. And then lastly, within these annual payments, you get a payment for any activity or enhancement that you've completed within the course of that year. So essentially, you could complete a practice in June, but you wouldn't get paid for the practice and your annual payments until, let's say, figuratively November, if you're doing it within that calendar year, or February of the following calendar year. So as far as eligibility for this particular program, like I stated, you have to meet at least 2 priority resource concerns when you apply. And then you must also agree to meet or exceed that stewardship threshold for at least 1 additional priority resource concern. So if you met a soil limitation resource concern and a plant limitation resource concern, you would have to either exceed one or the other, or meet another resource concern, as we go through the assessment by the end of that contract. And then, that would depend on what enhancements or practices you would be applying for within that contract to meet or exceed those resource concerns. So yeah, CSP, it's a bit more involved, but it's definitely an important program for those who are already doing their due diligence and want to do a bit more as far as conservation is concerned. And then the last program I want to go over today is the Agricultural Management Assistance Program, AMA. So this program helps producers and customers use conservation to manage risk and address natural resource issues through natural resource conservation. So AMA works relatively close with, it's relatively synonymous to EQIP, where we are addressing targeted resource concerns and mitigating them, single, as opposed to going as a broad scale. So with AMA, it's a bit more detailed than EQIP. So AMA is geared more toward risk. So certain things that may be involved with AMA will be risk associated with drought, risk associated with plant productivity, or risk associated with soil degradation. So the practices offered within this particular program are lessened because it's more geared toward risk. However, I feel like it gives way for more opportunity for producers to be funded to control some of these resource concerns that they're having on their property. So some resource concerns could be, water quality or water quantity, or having the system in place to be able to support your crops during a drought year, having this water availability, or even, initiating a cover crop, a high tunnel system to protect these crops, and extend the growing season so you have, more reliability throughout the year as opposed to being cut short. If we get an early winter or early frost or a late winter or late frost, having a bit more security as it comes to plant productivity, things of that nature. So a person or a legal entity cannot receive more than $50,000 within this program within a fiscal year. And then the states that are eligible for this program, all of the New England states seem to be involved. So if you have counterparts that are in, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, that may be having issues with irrigation and may be applying for EQIP and not get funded, I would consider letting them know that AMA is definitely an option, and they may be better serviced to get some of this taken care of on their property. So before I go into this next section, do I have any questions? Because I know that was quite a bit of information. No questions? Okay, I'll keep on pushing along. So next, we're going to go into assessments and ranking. So for all of the applicants who submitted applications within that the application deadline time period, you would work with your conservation planner. If you're in Windham County, you're most likely going to be working with me. And we're going to be setting up site visits. And depending on the severity of the contract, will most likely include technical specialists, whether they be soil scientists, engineers, stream bank stabilization specialists, wetland specialists, to make sure that we have that technical guidance and when it comes to assessing this project. And then, if it's forestry related, or even if it's engineering related, if you have a forester or a contractor that you'd like to be involved with this walkthrough, they're more than welcome to be with us. And then some projects require multiple site visits. So an example of a larger project would be working with farmsteads, with excuse me, y'all, my words today, with designing manure wastewater handling systems. It could take multiple site visits to make sure that we have all the information needed to assess the resource concerns and plan for mitigation. Planners will assess applications and rank applications based on the following: resource concerns for that particular application, resource inventory, so answering questions based off of the resource concerns identified, any existing practices or historical practices. So existing practices would be any practices that you have implemented on your own that have met NRCS's standards and specifications. Or historical practices would be, if you've been under contract with NRCS before, we would have record of your practices historically, and they would give you, credit toward your ranking score. And then your plan practices, what we're planning to mitigate your current resource concerns. And then the last stage of the process itself would be ranking. So these questions are generated from the national, state, and local offices based off of the concerns within that particular program. So if it's a funding pool that's geared toward forestry and wildlife, the national, state, and local questions will be geared toward, how this application is going to be mitigating resource concerns within this land use on a national scale, on a statewide scale, on a local scale. Next, we go into the ranking deadlines. So for all those participants who had submitted applications to meet the round 1 deadline, the ranking deadline to make sure that we have the application ready for state selection is March the 12th, 2021. And for those who may be interested after this presentation, the ranking deadline is May the 14th of 2021. So that's still for the round 2 applicants. It would be better service whenever I come out to your properties, because hopefully we'll have less snow. So it'd be easier to get around some of these properties as opposed to trying to get out, this past winter. And then the state office staff usually begin selecting applications after the ranking deadline. And we rank applications within different funding pools. So depending on what you're applying for, there's a high tunnel funding pool, there's farmsteads, there's one for forestry and wildlife, and then one for different programs, so that it gives way for more opportunity to have funding dispersed evenly and equitably across the state. All right, and we're going to go into pre-approvals and contract obligation. So applicants within any program should not commit any practice until contacted by a planner and they've received word that that contract has been obligated. So that's the word you always want to listen for whenever you are pre-approved. Whenever your contract is obligated, that means the money has been set aside, and you can actually commence your contract practices. You can start, and commencement could be, contacting a contractor. It could be site preparation. It could be buying seed. Whatever it is that's starting that practice, breaking some headway, that would be, you can start that once you've gotten word that your contract is obligated. And during the pre-approval realm or a time frame, applicants who've been selected, you have the opportunity to either accept or decline a contract opportunity. And if you do accept, we'll go through the contract appendix so you are aware of what's expected within that particular program. And then once you're fully obligated, a participant has 12 months from obligation to commence their first conservation practice. And like I said, commencement could be just starting that practice, getting bids from different contractors, buying a kit if it's a high tunnel, buying seed if it's a vegetative practice, things like that. But ultimately, even though you're going to be working with myself or even other planners or even other technical specialists, it's solely up to that participant to make sure that that practice is implemented to meet NRCS's standards and specifications. And I add in a timely fashion, if it's out of the control of the producer, life hit us really hard in 2020. A lot of things were out of our control. Projects weren't able to be implemented. There's opportunity for modifications of contracts, but if it's within your control, and if it's just the fact that you may need, assistance, things of that nature, feel free to reach out, because we want to try to get things implemented effectively and successfully, but we also want to get them in timely as possible, so we're not under or over planning contracts. And then lastly, we're going to go into payments and certifications. So as I stated earlier, EQIP and AMA, once you complete that, once you're obligated and you complete those practices, you can, we can make time to come out and visit the site, review the practice, make sure it meets set standards and specifications, and then from there, start the payment process. CSP payments are made annually. So even, like I said, even if you complete a practice in June, you still would have to wait until either November of that year or February of the following, year to receive your annual payment within CSP. And I did want to add this last tidbit because it seems like it became, I won't say an issue, but at least a concern for a producer. So I wanted to make sure that folks were aware that participants are responsible for paying income tax on NRCS payments. And it is denoted as taxable income. And that also applies to payment assignments. So if you are working with a contractor and you assign that payment to that contractor, even though that payment will be going to them as the contract holder, you would be responsible for paying income tax on that payment. And that's why these payments are usually spaced out over multiple tax years, so to kind of give way for you as the producer to plan, when these payments are coming in, when taxes will be due from the subsequent payments. So that was pretty much the bulk of my presentation. I just wanted to lastly leave you all with contact information for myself, Drew, Adam, and Corey, if you ever want to get in contact with us to do some conservation planning, assess some projects that may be happening on that you would like to see happening on your properties. Feel free to reach out to us. We can set up some times and dates and get the ball rolling. Do we have any questions? No questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Next, we have Nina Gage from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Farms and Markets, and Matt Gardner, who's an engineer with that agency. I'll let them start their screen share.
Thanks, Corey. Good morning, everyone. Can you guys confirm that you can hear me okay and see the screen?
Yes.
I think you're good.
Awesome. Thanks for the opportunity to get together and chat about our programs. And thanks, Joshua, for starting us off with NRCS programs. We're going to talk a little bit about Agency of Ag, water quality, technical, and financial assistance programs, and a couple quick disclosures. I am in the office today, so I will be putting my face mask on and off as I'm in the presence of others who might be walking behind me. Other disclosures, it's a beautiful day, hard to be inside, but I'm happy to be here with you all. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. Hi, I'm Matt Gardner. I'm an engineer at the Agency of Agriculture. I primarily offer technical assistance and design services and funding for production area water quality improvements through our BMP program, and that's what I'll be talking about during the presentation.
Thanks, Matt. And it looks like we have a couple other agency members on the call, so if you either of you want to introduce yourself, Phil or Amer, before we get into our programs.
Hi, I'm Amer Shuvalic. I'm working with Matt as an engineer, mostly on BMP grants. I work at in 4 counties in Vermont, and Windham County is one of them.
Yeah, and I'm Philip Wilson. I work for the Agency of Agriculture, primarily on a program called CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. And that is a tree and shrub planting program. It's actually a joint USDA Agency of Agriculture program. But take agricultural land adjacent to surface water, so streams, rivers, ponds, and plant them to trees and shrubs.
Thanks. And we'll get into each of those programs a little bit further in a moment here. Due to just the timing and the small group, I'll just say if you have a question in the middle of the presentation while we're talking about a specific program, please feel free to shout it out and we'll try to address it. So the first program I want to mention is the Farm Agronomic Practice Program, also known as FAP. We like acronyms too. Primarily, we provide a per acre payment for agronomic practice implementation. The practices eligible under the FAP program include cover crop, both drilled and broadcast, conservation crop rotation. That's a term that's used for when you flip a field from corn into hay or other perennial vegetation. It's also known as previously forage and biomass, so don't let the term confuse you there. We fund rotational grazing on farms in Vermont, conservation tillage, both reduced till and no-till pasture, hayland renovation. So that's using no-till grain drill in order to reseed pasture haylands. Frost seeding is not eligible. And the last eligible practice is manure injection. So the payment rate is going to vary depending on the practice within this program. We have a couple of deadlines to keep in mind if this is something you're interested in. Grazing applications are due the earliest, June 15th. Cover crop applications are due August 1st. And other applications are due 30 days prior to when you plan to install the practice. There is a cap at $8,000 per farm per state fiscal year. So keep that in mind. And you know, when we talk about state programs, the kind of basis of eligibility is that you're a farm required to follow the RAPs. Are there any questions before we move on to the next program about the FAP program? All right, and towards the end of this, I can pull up our website so I can show you how to navigate to all these different programs and forms. The next program, just to mention today, is the BMP program. So I'm going to turn over to Matt to walk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, so BMP is our primary funding mechanism for kind of production area infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, often the big ticket items when it comes to water quality, as far as what you get for your dollar. These often, usually, I'd say, are also more technically complex. They require engineering. It's comparable and often works hand in hand with the EQIP program through NRCS. The goals of the program are basically to provide infrastructure fixes to solve water quality issues in the farmstead. Things like, as simple as heavy use area protections, barnyards, clean water diversion, all the way up to manure storages. So we can provide up to $100,000 or 90% of a project's cost every year, with no more than $200,000 going to a single farm over a 3-year period. But if you also have an EQIP contract, we can provide additional funding toward that EQIP contract up to $200,000 a year, or 90% of the project cost. We've yet to have this happen because of the timing of the farm bills and stuff, but you could potentially see $400,000 of additional assistance toward EQIP contracts over a 3-year period. I challenge any of you to be able to pull that off. But the main point being, this is a significant additional source of funding for these large EQIP contracts. We do a lot of that. But as far as BMP standalone, we do have a April 1st deadline. It's a bit of a soft deadline. It's not just submitting an application. Basically, we need to have a project developed, concept project developed by April 1st to get to our first round of ranking. We sometimes do have additional rounds of ranking during the construction season. A concept, depending on the scope of the project, can be as simple as, okay, this is the resource concern. We're going to fix it with heavy use areas. We can rank you based on that. Sometimes it requires a little more if it's a really complex fix. This basically is just to prevent a situation where we either are trying to rank you, not knowing what the solution is, and then it's like, oh, it's way out of our scope as far as funding, or to get us in a situation where we are pushing seasonal limits, which in my experience is not fun for the farms when you're trying to pour concrete in 15 degrees in November. So if any of you are producers or you're working with farmers who need production area infrastructure, I would encourage you to get an application in or just contact an agency engineer, Matt, me, or Amer, or Nina. Nina's great at taking phone calls for us too. Feel free to call her. So we can get working and see if we can identify a project for this first round. I think that covers it, unless there are any questions. It's a simple program, high level, but the details really can get very complex. All right. Well, I'm turning it back to Nina. Thanks.
Matt, could you just touch on, the best process for if you just need assistance and some of the situations that folks might request just technical assistance towards?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our projects start as what we think of as just technical assistance, because someone, a partner or producer, will identify, a clear water quality concern, runoff leaving the production area, especially if it's commingled with waste. But, a big one, to give an example, is small producer knows they have a runoff issue, doesn't have any liquid storage, is really not sure what their options are. And really the first step for that is just to get an engineer out there to kind of assess the situation, maybe do a runoff audit, something like that, start to develop some numbers or a handle of the topography, and then start to navigate what those options are. It can be really tricky to solve a lot of these problems. So I guess one thing I would caution, if there are any partners on the call, we're starting to work closer with regional partners in the different conservation districts, but I would caution against pitching solutions to producers who are in that situation, because it sounds simple sometimes. Oh, we just need some concrete, but we pour concrete, we got to collect that runoff, and you can kind of start to open things up. So I'd say the big things to look for when it's appropriate to just reach out to BMP, even just to get a visit inside the production area. There's a little bit of gray area what that means, of course, but you can tend to know it when you see it. Inside the production area, water quality issues, which is waste or runoff that is leaving the production area. If it's headed toward a surface water, absolutely. But even if it's just something like we see a lot of just barnyards that maybe the runoff isn't heading dead toward a surface area, but the entire area is punched up. It's a giant mud hole, something like that. Like we get a lot of those projects too. Or if you have a farm that has the infrastructures collecting runoff and they're tight on storage every single year. You've got a farm that is, you know, biting their fingernails every May about their pit reaching the top. Give us a call. You know, we'll see what we can do there. That's a big one, as you know, as you all know, especially in southern Vermont, precipitation levels have been climbing pretty noticeably for the last several decades at this point, and you have a lot of undersized pits out there, and that can be really difficult, especially for small farms to manage. But even larger farms, as they're required to collect more and more, you know, we need to think really hard about how we manage all that volume. There's an initiative to do full collection on the farmstead, and of course we have to do that for anything that is waste, but you know, BMP can even help with, you know, clean water diversions, keeping ostensibly clean runoff out of those collection systems can be one of the biggest, you know, helps to even a very large farm. All right.
Thanks, Matt. I think we'll move on to the next program if everyone, unless there's any questions. All right. In the fall, we typically run a capital equipment assistance program funding round. The last few years, the application's been due on November 1st. We usually try to open the program around September. The primary, you know, things that you could receive funding for under this program are equipment. There's a couple different categories. So manure and silage management equipment, conservation tillage, cover crop, field improvement, precision agricultural equipment. And then usually biannually we run a funding round for innovative phosphorus separation or extraction equipment. So just to give some examples of some really successful projects under this program, we saw a lot of manure injectors, so specifically just the toolbar. Certain elements of a manure system, such as you know, tankers, are typically not funded under this program, but the innovative equipment that helps make you know, measurable or modelable reductions in water quality, such as manure injectors, are a great project. Another really successful equipment are no-till grain drills for cover cropping. And some precision ag equipment we've seen work well with a lot of farms. We've been, you know, riding the wave of kind of innovative precision stuff such as GPS, flow meter, data record keeping systems, just to help manage manure records on farms. Another example of some successful precision ag equipment that's been pretty interesting and fun to see is there's, you know, an influx of constituent sensors, from manure constituent sensors to harvest yield constituent sensors, which is kind of measuring the content of these materials as they're either field applied or harvested. So lots of cool, neat stuff happening there. It is a competitive program, and we work with budgets within all our programs and ranking. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But if this is something that you are working with a farm on a potential solution towards purchasing equipment, it's good to check out our website, learn the ropes, ask the questions earlier on, and feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss a specific project. One important thing to note on silage, so we do fund wraparound bales, bale wrappers, and brown bale equipment. One thing to note about that is we are only able to offer that funding in cases where there is an actual water quality concern or issue. and 2, where the solution is deemed to be a least cost alternative to a bunk relocation or replacement. So if you were to go to Matt and work with the BMP program, the proposed solution would cost more potentially than purchasing or and helping the farm transition into a wraparound bale feed management. So pretty limited scope there. We fund maybe 1 or 2 every year that fit that bill. So yeah, that's the equipment program. One thing to note about this is there are different caps depending on the type of equipment. And there are also reporting requirements for 3 years after you're awarded. So lots of paperwork here, maybe not as much as NRCS, but. Any questions on the SEEP program before we move on? All right, CREP, I'll just give a quick intro and then Phil, if you want to speak to this. Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is a quasi-state and federal program. We have folks in the state office who provide technical assistance to plan these projects and help you through the process, but it does require working with both state and federal agencies to sign agreements. And the major practices are for filter strips, forested buffers, and grass waterways. There are also rental payments and incentive payments within this program, but it's a longer term commitment. Phil, you want to add some thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, so I've worked on this program primarily. So Nina, can I share my screen here? I actually pulled up some examples.
Yeah, I think you can. You want to give it a go?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this for this program is the USDA and Agency of Ag program. So we take land that is currently in agriculture, so it needs to be annual cropland, so corn, soybeans, perennial cropland, so hay or pasture. And primarily we plant those to trees and shrubs. So this is an example, hopefully you guys can see this. This is a severely overgrazed pasture that was enrolled in the program. This is, before, and I can go through some of these time-lapse photos. You can see this was planted. This is a few years later. And finally I have some, this project is 15 years old. And here it is this summer. So looks, it's healed up quite a bit. So the program, as Nina said, has annual payments and upfront payments. So I looked up in Windham County, per acre of pasture producers this year would be eligible to receive rent on that land that's enrolled in the program of around $120 an acre for 15 years. And then for cropland, which we would like to buffers along streams and ponds in cropland settings too, that pays between $75 and $150 an acre per year over a 15. And these are 15-year agreements. And then there's also upfront money that you get from state and federal government of between $300 and up to $1,900 an acre. It's a one-time payment to enroll in the program. So typically we work with producers, landowners, farmers to identify projects they'd like to enroll. We plan them out and then plant them in the spring of the following spring. So this is a statewide program, so certainly Windham County is eligible. So, and other farmers throughout the state. So I can answer any other questions.
Thanks, Phil. And I'll, is it all right if I steal the screen back?
Yep, we'll stop. There you go.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing those photos. It's
Mhm.
really cool to see a buffer kind of over time change and really transform the environment that you might have started working with.
Yeah, it's pretty wild sometimes.
All right, couple more programs to get through here. So the next program I'll mention, the next two programs have rolling applications with CREP. So if you're interested, you should get in touch because they all require some aspect of technical assistance and planning. The pasture surface water fencing program can provide assistance for a variety of practices on pasture and grazing land. Primarily, fence and water sources to improve grazing areas, whether it's excluding surface water or helping, cross over surface water into other paddocks. The idea is really that it's a 90% cost share to help make improvements to a grazing system that are going to result in water quality benefits. Like our other programs, this program is competitive and it's works with a budget that we get on an annual basis. So if you're interested, you have a producer interested, it's best to get in touch as soon as possible. The other program that accepts requests on a rolling basis is the Grass Waterway Filter Strip program. This program can provide a per acre incentive payment to seed down some areas on annual crop fields to either filter strips or grass waterways. And in some cases, the whole field can be seeded down if it's considered a critical source area. Any questions on those two programs? All right. So just to mention some of the administrative requirements, if you've never worked with the state before, you will be asked to do some W-9 form in order to get into the state financial system. Anyone working with the state apart from the FAP program is required to submit a certificate of insurance with liability coverage that includes the state as additional insured. And that's one big difference between the federal programs is this insurance requirement for all state programs. Something to be aware of when you are interested or working towards a grant. It will be a requirement. And the third kind of major requirement is you have to complete an Act 154 water good standing compliance form, and this has to do with state and federal water quality regulations. So just a couple things to know ahead of time. And I'm just gonna really briefly show you how to navigate our website if you're interested in finding more information about any of our programs. The ones we've gone through today are primarily water quality financial assistance programs, but if you go to the Agency of Ag's homepage at agriculture.vermont.gov, there's a tab up top called Funding Opportunities. This is going to show, programs outside of just water quality. To give an example, the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program or the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative, which are other agency-funded programs. And at the top of this, there is a calendar of funding opportunities, and it gives you a little bit of information if you're trying to plan your season or your year as to when a certain opportunity becomes available, to look at the application materials and understand the requirements. If you don't already, I highly recommend folks subscribe to the agency's monthly newspaper called Ag Review. You can also request that on our website. We publish information as programs roll out and other opportunities as they come up in that newspaper, and it gets mailed on a monthly basis. In paper, it's a real newspaper. Just to give you a sense of kind of the extent of these programs, we operate with annual budgets on all of our programs, so we are balancing the need and requests with the highest priority projects and trying to have the biggest benefit for the state as far as water quality improvements. So our FAP program last year had about 150 folks that we worked with throughout the season. BMP had about 110 different practices that went in statewide. SEEP, we usually work between 27 and 30 different recipients. Pasture surface water fencing is increasing from the previous years. About 35 practices were implemented in last state fiscal. And grass waterway filter strip, we had, I think, 3 folks we worked with last year for about 15 acres of conservation installed. And CREP was on hold for a couple of years, but is now back up and running, thanks to some of the great work that Phil has been able to make that now available to Vermont farms. A couple of things that we work within is based on our requirements and statute. So we are required to prioritize in most programs the Lake Champlain Basin over other areas of the state, but by no means does that mean we don't work with folks in all areas of the state. So when we rank and approve applications in any specific funding source, we are required to follow our statutory guidance, which often includes a priority of basins. But at the same time, we are spending funds every fiscal in all areas of the state. We also work with a variety of technical assistance and service providers across the state, outside of the state government. So, you know, Matt and I work for the state, but Corey is a great example of an individual who works at the local conservation district. They can help put you in touch with the right people or just help you plan a project for the initial stages, maybe do a little bit of the research needed for the application materials. We also work closely with the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, the farmer watershed groups, and some smaller outreach and monitoring groups. And with that said, I'll just mention, you know, I would encourage you to check out our website and get comfortable looking at the different programs that are available and the requirements under each program. And you can find that information on our website. It's agriculture.vermont.gov/grants. The exclamation is just me. There's no actual exclamation at the end of that URL. And I got some contact information down here for Matt and myself. If you have further questions or need assistance, feel free to reach out and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you, Nina and Matt and Phil. Are there questions for anybody about all this material that was presented? All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Once again, I just put my contact info in the chat box. Please feel free to reach out if you are looking for any sort of on-farm technical assistance or just need help figuring out who to call. I'm happy to do that research for you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Corey.
Thank you.
Y'all have a
Take
good
care.
one.
Thank you.
Hey, who's up there? Hang on, I gotta exit.